The debate over who should be the next Chicago Bears head coach seems to mostly be Ben Johnson versus Mike Vrabel. But if we want to argue about up-and-coming offensive coordinator versus veteran NFL head coach, then the debate really should be Ben Johnson versus Pete Carroll, not Mike Vrabel.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1, and you can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use our promo code LockedOnNFL to win $50 instantly when you play $5. On the show today, we hone in on Pete Carroll as a Bears head coaching candidate and why I think if you want to go the veteran head coach route, he's a better option than Mike Vrabel. I'm not here today to specifically debate Carroll over like Ben Johnson or some of the other coordinators, but I do think if you're going to go the retread route, a guy who's been an NFL head coach before because you like the safety and security of that, Carroll is a better option for the Bears than Mike Vrabel. We'll look at their coaching records, the success they've had, what they've been able to accomplish with what's been in their way, what kind of talent they've been able to work with, what kind of opposition they faced along the way there. We'll also look at their coaching trees and the track record for the coaches that they've put around them and developed around them and the successes and failures they've each had throughout that process. And then we'll talk a little bit bigger picture about fit with the Chicago Bears and why Pete Carroll feels a lot more like the kind of hire a Bears would make as opposed to Mike Vrabel. But I think first and foremost, like the elephant in the room with Pete Carroll, right, is the age. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on here. That's obviously the immediate, well, he's 73, so that's why the Bears shouldn't hire Pete Carroll. And I just want to acknowledge that on the front end that, like, yes, that's real. He would be the oldest head coach in football, but I'm not as concerned about that. And to me, that's kind of the only area you can point to as like, yes, Vrabel is younger. There's no debating that. Vrabel is the younger coach, and that is an advantage he has over Pete Carroll. Pretty much the rest of the way, though, Carroll seems to be pretty clearly the better candidate between the two. When you look at what they've been able to do in their respective careers, Pete Carroll has a better winning percentage. Pete Carroll has done more in the playoffs. Pete Carroll has done so in a more difficult division. Pete Carroll has a stronger coaching tree and has a better track record of identifying and developing coaches in addition to identifying and developing players. Like, I think from a coaching leadership standpoint, they've both been good culture guys who have steadied their organizations while they were there and provided the kind of leadership the Bears are looking for. And Carroll just has a lot of the other on-field advantages. Like, if we look back at Pete Carroll's coaching career, he was with the Seahawks for like 14 seasons. But if we even just look, we know, okay, top of Pete Carroll's resume, won the Super Bowl and then went back to the Super Bowl in the second year and lost. 2 Super Bowl trips back-to-back, 1 win. That sort of speaks for itself. We don't need to spend a lot of time saying, yes, Carroll's got a Super Bowl, Mike Vrabel doesn't. But that's not a very nuanced argument. That's a little bit too simple here. I want to go a bit beyond that. So if you look, even just since Pete Carroll went to the Super Bowl last, 2014 was their second Super Bowl year. If you look 2015 to 2023, the final, 9 years or so of his career with the Seattle Seahawks, over that stretch, he went under 500 once and only missed the playoffs twice since the Super Bowl, right? Since making the Super Bowl twice, which is already like the peak. This is sort of his decline after making the Super Bowl. What has he done since he made the Super Bowl in 2014? He went to the playoffs in 7 out of 9 years, and he finished above 500 in 8 out of 9 years. 10 wins, 10 wins, 9 wins, 10 wins, 11 wins, 12 wins. The worst year was 2021, was 7 wins, and then 9 wins over each of his last 2 seasons in Seattle. He had 3 different playoff wins in 3 different seasons there. 2015, 2016, they won wildcard games, and then in 2019, won wildcard games. This team was consistently getting to the postseason and consistently scoring double-digit wins, and also, I should mention, consistently finishing in the top 10 in offensive scoring over this stretch, in addition to the great defense that Seattle was coaching at the time, all in an NFC West division that had the Los Angeles Rams going to the Super Bowl twice, the San Francisco 49ers going to the Super Bowl twice over the stretch. So yeah, he only won the division twice from 2015 on, but that's because he's going against Sean McVay's Super Bowl Rams and Kyle Shanahan's Super Bowl 49ers. Like, I think the fact that he was able to win 9, 10, and 11 games so often over this stretch, while also in such a tough division, speaks to how good of a coaching job he did there. You can certainly point to not going beyond the divisional round in any of those playoff runs, never winning more than one playoff game in those stretches, but still winning some playoff games. Winning in the playoffs is hard. And I'm not here to say Pete Carroll is some perfect head coaching candidate. Not at all. He's got flaws and things to not like about him, but I do think he's a better option than Mike Vrabel. Because when you compare Mike Vrabel's record to Pete Carroll's record, Vrabel obviously a much shorter amount of time, a smaller sample size, but Mike Vrabel made the playoffs 3 times, but only won a playoff game in one season. In 2019, his second year, they go to the AFC Championship game. We all remember that Titans run. Very impressive. Credit to Mike Vrabel for winning 2 playoff games and getting to the AFC Championship game. His teams never won a playoff game after that. And it's easy to kind of forget. Like, I think something about Vrabel being away for a year glosses over how the Titans weren't that great, especially down the stretch towards the end there. He had 2 seasons with double-digit wins. He went 9-7, 9-7, then 11-5, 12-5, and then under 500, 7-10, 6-11, flaming out at the end with an old and aging Ryan Tannehill. And really, after they lost Matt LaFleur and then Arthur Smith left after 2020, their next offensive coordinator, Todd Downing, wasn't great, and then they kind of fired Todd Downing. Never really got the offensive coordinator thing figured out after they lost Arthur Smith. They drafted Malik Willis. They drafted Will Levis. Never really got the quarterback thing figured out. It was getting messy in Tennessee, and then you add in the power struggle. That's really what got him fired. I was talking to Tyler Rowland from Locked On Titans. I'm like, how much of that was power struggle versus on-field stuff? Mostly power struggle, but on-field was a good excuse, right? They wanted to keep the GM over the head coach, so they fired the head coach and used the 7-10, 6-11 record as an easier way to fire him, but really it was, the power struggle was a bigger issue there than the on-field stuff. But like, pretty clearly, lower winning percentage than Pete Carroll over the course of their coaching careers, less playoff success than Pete Carroll over their coaching careers. And another important part of this that we'll get into in a moment here is also like the coaching tree and the picks they've made on their staff. There's a vast difference between these two. But I also just think it's important to note, like, Mike Vrabel is doing this in the AFC South. Pete Carroll is doing this in the NFC West. And there's no such thing as a totally easy division, but clearly when the NFC West has 2 other teams going to the Super Bowl and the AFC West has no one sniffing the Super Bowl, you have a bad Jaguars team, an up and down Texans team over that stretch, and then Jaguars, Titans, Texans. Why am I missing the 4th AFC South team here? Colts. Oh, the Indianapolis Colts kind of being up and down in that process too. Like, it was not as though the Titans were struggling against some powerhouses in their division the way the Seahawks had to battle every single year twice, kind of like what the Bears are doing with now in the NFC North. You got a couple of really good teams you're battling against every single year, and it's hard to be consistently good, and yet Pete Carroll was, and Mike Vrabel was decently good, but not dominant, and never really replicated the playoff success they had in that 2019 season. Everything else was kind of falling flat. So, like, I just think we overhype how good Mike Vrabel was, and maybe we underappreciate how good Pete Carroll was. It's not that these 2 coaches are on 2 completely different planes here. Like, Mike Vrabel's a good coach, Pete Carroll's a good coach. They're both good coaches. But I think from a win-loss record standpoint, a success standpoint, what they've been able to do, I mean, Carroll helped identify Russell Wilson as a diamond in the rough 3rd-round pick. Carroll helped rejuvenate Geno Smith and identify him as a quarterback talent that they could elevate. And Vrabel, quarterback was always, Tannehill, Levis, Malik Willis, just never really quite figured out the quarterback thing there. Like, there's on-field seems to lend a lot of reasons to Pete Carroll, and the coaching staff picks also lean Pete Carroll as well. We'll go through their respective coaching trees and why you might be surprised some of the names that Pete Carroll helped develop into NFL head coaches next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by Intuit TurboTax. Are you tired of the endless waiting, worrying, and wondering about your taxes? Well, now that's a thing of the past. Taxes don't need to be complicated or stressful. TurboTax is here to change the game by matching you with a TurboTax expert who can get to work on your return right away. No more waiting for answers, no more wondering if you're missing out on deductions. Whether you've got one form or 20, TurboTax experts give your taxes their undivided attention while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on what really matters. You won't have to lift a finger, but you'll get the peace of mind knowing that your taxes are being handled by the pros. Ready for stress-free taxes and the most money back guaranteed? Head over to TurboTax.com today and get matched with your expert who's ready to take your taxes off your plate so you can focus on your day. Only available with TurboTax Live full service. Real-time updates only in the iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. The Locked On Bears podcast is also brought to you by PrizePicks, the better way to play daily fantasy sports. It's playoff time, and if you're like me, you want to make the most out of these final weeks of football action, and that's where PrizePicks comes in because PrizePicks gives you a chance to win real money while watching the games. It's the best way to turn your sports opinions into cash with daily fantasy player projections. With PrizePicks, you simply pick more or less on player stats, like total passing yards or rushing touchdowns, for a shot to win up to 1,000 times your money. You can make your picks in less than 60 seconds, and there's a lot of different fun ways to play, not only with these playoff games, but you can bet on basketball and hockey and soccer and all of your favorite sports, all in the PrizePicks app. And with over 10 million members and billions in winnings, it's clear that people are loving PrizePicks. It's just a fun way to give you a little something extra to tune in for and to be rooting for in these games on the weekend. And we've got a special offer for Locked On Bears listeners. Download the PrizePicks app today and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Whether that lineup hits or misses, doesn't matter. You're getting those $50 instantly when you play $5 with PrizePicks. Run your game. Pete Carroll had more consistent on-field success than Mike Vrabel. He sustained his success longer, went on more playoff runs, longer playoff runs, even after the 2 trips to the Super Bowl. He was the more prolific, successful coach on the field with the more difficult circumstances of being in the NFC West as opposed to the easier AFC South. But beyond that, Pete Carroll was better at picking the type of assistant coaches he would work with and developing those assistant coaches into successful coaches in their own right. Pete Carroll obviously has a lot more years of coaching experience in the NFL and a longer track record to pull from his coaching tree. So I don't want to use the size advantage of the tree where there's a bunch more coaches that Carroll had influence on than Mike Vrabel. But specifically, I want to think about the quality of the coaches that worked under Pete Carroll versus the quality of the coaches that worked under Mike Vrabel. Because when we talk about hiring this CEO type of head coach for the Bears, right, there's going to be a lot of questions about, okay, who's your offensive coordinator going to be? Who's your quarterback's coach going to be? How are you going to develop that side of the ball? And then also, how are you going to maintain defense at a high level? What are the coaches you're going to hire, and how are they going to sustain success on the Chicago Bears? Because the fear, whether it's Vrabel or Carroll, is that, okay, even if you have a good offensive coordinator at first, that coach might get hired away, and then who you're going to replace him with. And do you have the right CEO leader type of coach who can continually replenish the coaching tree with quality coaches by identifying coaches who are smart and then developing them and empowering them so that they grow into bigger roles and become better coaches, having worked for you as a coach? And I think there's a pretty clear, consistent record for Pete Carroll on both sides of the ball of coaches who he has brought in, coached up, worked with them, and then they've gone on to have success. Whereas Vrabel has had some hits, but some bigger misses in there too. And Carroll, by all means, has misses as well. It's not to say that one is perfect versus one is not, but it just seems to me like a pretty clearly stronger coaching tree and record of helping coaches get better with Carroll leading the charge there. So let's start with Mike Vrabel by comparison here. Of course, the obvious ones that come to mind right away. Matt LaFleur, the Green Bay Packers coach, was the Titans offensive coordinator under Mike Vrabel. Obviously, a very talented head coach, a skilled offensive mind who is very good at what he does. That's a big plus in the Mike Vrabel category. He replaced Matt LaFleur, who's definitely the head of the honcho here, with head of the honcho, you know what I mean? Who's like the top name here. Replaced him with Arthur Smith. Okay, Arthur Smith did a decent job, decent enough to get hired by the Atlanta Falcons as a head coach. Obviously didn't do well in Atlanta. Now he's the Pittsburgh Steelers head coach and getting an interview from the Bears. So, not a terrible coordinator by any means, but maybe not a great coordinator either. Can he be somewhere in the middle? And then you didn't have much else from Vrabel, because then his next offensive coordinator was Todd Downing. He lasted a couple years before they moved on from him because the offense wasn't good enough. They brought in one more guy at the end for 1 year before Vrabel left, and offense didn't get much better then either. He found LaFleur was a good find. Arthur Smith worked out well in Tennessee. He found a couple, but the pipeline kind of dried up a little bit from there. And that's not to say Pete Carroll then had some perfect pipeline of offensive coordinators, but I think there's a more consistent track record of the Seahawks offense staying average to above average for a lot longer, whereas the Titans offense started to drop off more and more the later you went in with Mike Vrabel. So for Vrabel, it's Matt LaFleur, it's Arthur Smith, it's Todd Downing, and then Tim Kelly was their fourth offensive coordinator, who had previously been a Texans offensive coordinator, so he has some experience. And Vrabel had a couple of decent defensive coordinators in Dean Pease and Shane Bowen. I believe it's pronounced Bowen. I'm not positive about that. Like, both of those guys coached in Tennessee with Mike Vrabel and went on to be defensive coordinators. Dean Pease has been a 4-time NFL defensive coordinator. Shane Bowen is now the defensive coordinator for the New York Giants, had been previously the defensive coordinator with Vrabel in Tennessee. So yeah, there's a few coaches there that have been coordinators elsewhere or whatever, and Vrabel and LaFleur is obviously a big hit there, and Arthur Smith is a pretty decent hit there as well. But then everyone else is a little bit, I don't know, is underwhelming too strong a word there? Okay, they're fine. But then I look over at Pete Carroll, and you have some current head coaches, some former head coaches, and a bunch of other current coordinators on his list of coaching tree people. Like, right away, you might not know this, but Carolina Panthers head coach Dave Canales, who was Baker Mayfield's offensive coordinator with the Buccaneers last year when they kind of turned Baker Mayfield around. You know where he got his start in the NFL? Pete Carroll and the Seattle Seahawks. He was their wide receivers coach, then QB coach, then passing game coordinator. Then he jumped to the Buccaneers, and now he's the Carolina Panthers head coach. Pete Carroll developed Dave Canales, and Dave Canales helped develop Geno Smith throughout that process. And then, of course, we know guys like Gus Bradley and Dan Quinn were Pete Carroll's defensive coordinators, went on to be head coaches. Dan Quinn now head coach again with the Washington Commanders. Robert Saleh was an assistant coach with the Seattle Seahawks as well under Pete Carroll, working his way up to getting to be Jets head coach, and is going to be a defensive coordinator again in the NFL soon. But there's just a bunch of other guys. I mean, you look at other Seahawks defensive coordinators like Ken Norton or Chris Richard, Todd Walsh, who've bounced around. The 49ers defensive coordinator, Nick Sorensen, right now, was previously an assistant for the Seattle Seahawks. The Panthers offensive coordinator under Dave Canales, Brad Idzik, was a Pete Carroll coach. Again, Brian Schottenheimer maybe wasn't the best offensive coordinator in Seattle. Shane Waldron had his ups and downs in Seattle and certainly his downs in Chicago. I'm not here to say Carroll picks perfect coaches every time and never regrets any of them and never has to fire any of them. No, but rare do you see a guy like this who Pete Carroll's more of a defensive coach from a leadership standpoint, but has developed offensive coaches as well because of the kind of culture he creates, because of how he empowers coaches to be themselves and to grow within their roles. And obviously there have been, accusations of meddling in the offense and disagreements and stuff, and it's never perfect clean. Again, I will reiterate, I'm not arguing that Carroll is the perfect candidate who should be the number one choice. I just think when you're thinking veteran head coach, Carroll seems to have it more than Vrabel. The main drawback here is the age, and that he's 73. But I think that's not as big of a deal as we might make it out to be. And I think he's still a better fit with what the Bears are and want than what Mike Vrabel offers. And I think there's something going on here that's a little bit more superficial than perfectly logical when it comes to how we view both of these coaches. So I kind of want to take stock of well, then why is it that people seem to view Vrabel in a better light than Pete Carroll when Carroll's got the better coaching tree and the better coaching record? Next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. From big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel. Because right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed with your first $5 bet. So whether that $5 bet wins or loses, it doesn't matter. FanDuel is going to add an extra $200 in bonus bets into your account. Whether you want to bet on these NFL playoff games or you want to bet on the NBA season, the NHL season, college bowl games, college basketball, March Madness is not far away around the corner here, soccer, tennis, the combat sports, you name it, they've got it all on FanDuel. And they also have everything you need for live bets, same game parlays, and so much more. There are so many different ways to win and have fun in FanDuel. And to place $5 bet on any of them to get those bonus bets guaranteed. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. It's clear to me that like all the empirical football-y kind of reasons put Pete Carroll ahead of Mike Vrabel. Maybe only slightly, but still ahead of Mike Vrabel nonetheless. Again, not here to tear down Vrabel as some bad candidate and Carroll as some perfect candidate, but I think Carroll has the much stronger resume all around. The main thing is Carroll is 73 and Mike Vrabel is not. I don't have Vrabel's age in front of me, but he's like late 40s, early 50s, or maybe late 50s. I don't remember. But regardless, there's a good 15 plus year age gap there. And the idea is like, okay, Carroll would be the oldest head coach in the NFL once again the moment you hire him. How many years will Carroll still want to be coaching in the NFL? How many more years will he be Chicago Bears head coach if he's 73 now? Will he coach into his 80s? I mean, never say never. We've had back-to-back elections with presidential candidates in their 80s. If you can be president in your 80s, can you be an NFL head coach in your 80s? I mean, that's something I've been thinking about here when it comes to this. But I also think it's just kind of I think there is some sort of bias in here because he's a little bit on the older side. I don't think he's shown great signs of aging, but I think there's something to be said about, Vrabel is younger and more full of energy and that people just like Vrabel's vibes better than Pete Carroll. Vrabel is the big bravado, takes over the room, and if Mike Vrabel's in there, and he's not afraid to swear at press conferences, and he's going to shoot you straight. And Mike Vrabel is the coach who's just going to be tougher than you. And I think there's a Dan Campbell ripple effect here of like we've seen the sort of meathead style of coach be so successful in Detroit that by proxy, I think it inflates Mike Vrabel because he's a little bit more in that Dan Campbell kind of style of coaching, leadership, toughness bunch. And I think there's some similarities between the two. I think there's a little bit of a difference between Campbell and Vrabel where like Campbell is so like genuinely unauthentically himself. And I don't always get that same thing. Like Vrabel, they're both tough guys, but Campbell is more of like a genuine and like a vulnerable tough guy, and Vrabel's more of like a cold tough guy. Campbell's more of a warm tough guy. If that makes any sense. Like I think there's a slightly different flavor of the tough guy act that they both have going on. Whereas Pete Carroll is quite literally smaller in statute. He's a little bit scrawny, a little bit hunched over, a little bit short. We picture him on the sideline chewing gum kind of aggressively and just being a little bit more soft-spoken. Maybe even a little bit, I don't want to say wacky, right? But there's always been a little bit of a touch of like conspiracy theory vibes around Pete Carroll. I think there's some stuff in his past where he's said some things. I don't want to speak too out of turn here, but like there's some 9/11 stuff around Pete Carroll. I remember that being a thing. You can Google it and read up on it if you want to, but like he's there's been some thought that he's a 9/11 truther in some of this stuff that kind of has been swept under the rug because it was like a decade ago now. But nonetheless, like, yeah, there's some little weird stuff around Pete Carroll here and there. But I just think there's sort of a football tough guy thing about Vrabel that people look at him and think, well, that's just what tough football coach guy looks like. And so I want that, even if that doesn't necessarily specifically correlate with being a better coach or not. Like the important stuff is, culture, winning games, developing players, developing coaches, identifying talent, like, the stuff that actually matters. And whether you're the tough guy coach or the more of a soft kind of coach is less important as long as you have all of that other stuff. So I think Vrabel kind of gets an unfair bump in that regard from a lot of us on the outside. For the Chicago Bears, though, I think the opposite may end up being true. the Bears have never been an organization that hires the big, bold, bravado coach. This has been an organization that particularly steers clear from the big, bold, bravado coach. I mean, famously, the joke now is about how George McCaskey doesn't like swearing. Like, that's not a joke. It's not that it is true that he doesn't like it when people swear. And of course, you make the jokes then that like, oh, they're only going to listen to censored music, and that they're going to find out a coach has sworn once in their life, and then they're never going to hire them. But like, I think there's something to be said there when the Bears don't consider Jim Harbaugh, because he's a little bit more of a bravado style of big, bold coach who maybe swears sometimes. The Bears pass on. They don't go for Harbaugh. They prefer Matt Eberflus. A little bit more soft-spoken, a little bit more calm, easygoing kind of guy. They don't go for Dan Quinn, who's a little bit more big, carry-the-room, tough guy coach a couple years ago. They stick with Eberflus because he's a little bit more softer-spoken, a little bit easier going. John Fox, Matt Nagy, a little bit calmer, a little bit lower energy, a little bit easier going guys. I think back to 2013. Mark Trestman and Bruce Arians are like opposite ends of the spectrum here, right? Trestman, calmer, easier going. Yeah, guys, we're going to have a great offense this year, and we're really looking forward to getting Jay and Brandon Marshall out there, and we're going to score a lot of points. I don't know why I'm giving a Southern accent, but that's the style. Whereas Bruce Arians isn't going to take no crap from nobody. Like the Bears have, and Lovie Smith, of course, before that, like the Bears have consistently, under George McCaskey especially, wanted the calmer, softer spoken, easier coaches. And we know George McCaskey does not like swearing. Mike Vrabel swears a lot and is not going to take any crap from nobody. And that doesn't feel like the kind of coach that George McCaskey is going to go for. I'm not saying George McCaskey is correct for thinking that way about these coaches, but I think I can make the argument that not only is Carroll the better candidate between the two, but Carroll's also the candidate that the Bears will like better because they like that style of coach more. To be fair, I also think Ben Johnson fits in that style of coach as well. So it's not as though, the Bears aren't going to pursue any good candidates because they're scared of big bravado coaches. But I do think Vrabel doesn't fit the kind of candidate the Bears typically go after. And so I'm not expecting them to hire Mike Vrabel or maybe even go to a second round of interviews with Mike Vrabel, perhaps because he'll be hired by the Patriots or the Raiders before the Bears even get that far, but also because I just don't think he's the style of coach George McCaskey and the McCaskey family want representing their franchise. Right or wrong, which they're probably wrong to be so strict about that. I would think that's probably an incorrect. You shouldn't let swearing be the reason you don't hire a coach. If he's the right coach, get the coach whether he's loud and big bravado or not. Would they pass on Dan Campbell because of the way he carries himself? Maybe, and that'd be a mistake, So like, it's a bad process for them to think that way. But if we're trying to predict what they might do, I don't think Vrabel's going to be the coach for them. And I think same thing with Todd Monken, the Baltimore Ravens offensive coordinator, who's the Bears are going to bring, is another one of these swears a lot, big bravado kind of coaches. I don't think the Bears are going to hire Todd Monken either. They want calmer, easier going coach who's just going to speak down here and it's going to be okay. And so that's where I think Pete Carroll makes it all around the stronger candidate for the Chicago Bears. If we're thinking veteran head coach, he's the way I'd go. If you're thinking offensive coordinator or assistant coach, like Ben Johnson is still the way I'll go. And I want to dig into Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn a little bit more next week on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit the subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to the podcast, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Really appreciate you making Locked On Bears our first listen. Come on back on Monday and make Locked On Bears your first listen once again for another opportunity to bear down.